Okay, so this is part three. We're getting ready to talk about sexual stuff. And look, I know you guys talk about this and think about sex enough without me bringing it up, but we have to. The reality is that the Victorians didn't think that women could enjoy sex anyway. So not being sexual was not a big loss to her. And instead of fueling her husband's desires by being very passionate, she was instead supposed to persuade the husband to care more for the family matters, to worry about his business and stuff like that. Or, hey, honey, let's read. And if she failed to curb his desires, like if he cheated, it was her fault because she had not curbed his desires. The guy can't do it. The guy was incapable of controlling that side of himself. And so the wife had to take that responsibility and accept the failure if she couldn't do it. Now, heaven forbid she ever succumb to infidelity because she was pretty much then at the husband's mercy for divorce or punishment. I mean, he couldn't kill her, but, physical abuse or whatever was not terribly uncommon. I mean, it wasn't the norm, but it wasn't unknown. Now, being named in a divorce suit was a huge disgrace. So most of these kinds of, issues or disagreements, however you want to put it, were usually solved, behind closed doors because you did not want to be named in a divorce. Now, I will tell you that, we know also that the Victorian age is known for love marriages and, people getting married, especially in the middle class, because they fell in love with each other. So while we have this image of, women can't enjoy sex and whatever, I think behind closed doors, these marriages were passionate and so on. So, a lot of times the official party line, for the public was different than what was really going on behind closed doors. Sex actually is one of the most widely remembered things about Victorian society, or it's de-emphasis. Like the conversation that we've just had, and we really didn't say anything about sex, really. We would never have had that conversation in public in the Victorian age, just period. And we would never have written about it either. See, there's lots of novels that are written at the time, but the novel was designed to instruct in morals while it amuses. So it was designed to teach us the right from wrong, not, fire us up by talking about sexual things. And it's interesting because there's lots of Victorian novels that were considered to be very racy and very risque or whatever at the time. And you read through them and you're like, I didn't even see anything. And you have to look very carefully. So you might have, for example, a couple is walking in the woods or whatever, and the chapter ends, and the beginning of the next chapter, the sun's coming up. And it's like, oh, okay, I know what happened there. Or, they fell together into the grass, and then the next thing you know, there's butterflies around. And it's like, okay, I know what happened there. And that was considered like, oh my God, I can't believe that they actually, set that scene. The Victorians very easily could be considered prudish or sort of, uptight or whatever. And sometimes this led to kind of crazy practices. One of the things I used to do, I don't do it too much anymore, is I would watch these decorating shows. And a lot of times they'd say, well, we're getting ready to do a Victorian whatever. And I'm like, all right, let's see how they can screw this up. And they always would. And one of the things that they would always harp on is, well, the Victorians like to read, and so they always had libraries, and so we're going to put some bookcases in here. And they never got it right. When you went into a Victorian household, middle class household, there were going to be books everywhere, and they would have a library if they had room for it. So you go to the bookcase, and there would always been a row of bookends going down the middle of the shelf, which you don't need, right? Because the bookcase is holding the books in. But the reason they put these bookends there is because they didn't want books written by male and female authors to be touching, because they'd like rub up against one another. So they were separated on the shelf. And I think a lot of Victorians would have freaked out if they had realized that lots of women were writing under male pseudonyms because they had to get their books published. Like if you were talking about a table, you wouldn't say, oh, look at the legs of the table, because legs, that could be legs. And so you would use a word like limbs. You would talk about like the limbs of the couch or the limbs of the table. If you went into a Victorian house, and this is again something that those designer types always mess up, around the bottom of the couch, because the couches would have like little feet that look like animal feet and stuff a lot of times. And so around the bottom of the couch, they would put a little skirt, tack a little skirt on there so you couldn't see up under there. And Same thing with your dining room table. The tablecloth was so long that it would drag on the floor because you didn't want to be looking up under there, at the limbs, because that was something. So, kind of absurd practices. And we know that, this is a very, very strict code and a lot of pressure for people to live up to. And we know not everybody was able to do it. I mean, the Victorian period was known for having a very, very flourishing pornography trade. Look, as soon as somebody said, hey, I made a camera, it's kind of like, hey, guess what else we can do here? And especially in England, but elsewhere as well, there was a huge prostitution underworld. I mean, it was back in the 1800s. The city of London itself is not actually very big, and you couldn't walk from one end of London to another without somebody trying to pickpocket you, or without prostitutes pestering you. And so a guy was visiting London. He got off the train, stepped out of the train station, and he was just besieged by prostitutes. And this is like in the middle of the day. They were just everywhere. So obviously everybody was not able to live up to those very strict standards. Well, that's enough about sex. And, there's a couple of things that start to change these Victorian ideals after around 1900. Part of it is Victoria herself is ready to die. And, I think people are pretty much ready for her to go at that point. You read about imperialism before, and imperialism starts changing people's focus from inside the country to outside the country. So they're sort of thinking abroad now. The 1890s, there was a major economic depression, second only to the Great Depression. So it was very, very serious, and that limited the ability of the middle class to just buy, because that's what they did. We also, perhaps not surprisingly, see the beginnings of serious efforts at women's rights. Now, we don't really have much of a women's movement until the first part of the 1900s, the 19 teens, really. But agitation and demonstrations had started before the turn of the century. And, we start seeing women being admitted to the universities for the first time. And, you can go back through history and find a stray female student here or there, but certainly not noticeable and certainly not in any number. But that had changed in the 1800s, and there were, of course, women's colleges as well. 1893, women were granted the right to vote in the first country to do so, and that was New Zealand. But by World War I, which is 1914, the only other countries that had followed were Norway and Finland. Now, New Zealand sounds kind of like a strange place for that to happen, but it actually has a lot in common with the first U.S. state that granted women the right to vote, and that was Wyoming. And you might say, what could New Zealand and Wyoming possibly have in common? Well, they actually have a lot in common. They're both frontier areas. I mean, if you were moving to Wyoming or moving to New Zealand, you were moving out into the middle of absolutely nowhere. It was hostile territory for sure. And everybody had to carry their weight. I mean, everybody had to do their part. And whether they wanted to or not, men were sort of forced to recognize women's abilities. And it's not an accident that the first about 8 or so states in the U.S. that grant women the vote were all Western states. The first non-Western one was New York in, I think, 1912, something like that. Well, what we start seeing then, as we get into the first part of the 20th century, is serious women's movements in places like Britain and the U.S., also in Australia, which hasn't been studied as much. France has a large women's movement. It's kind of a little bit different because it's France. But they don't really have much success until after World War I, and then they really, really have to push for the vote. Now, I want to just say a little bit about the turn of a century here as we get into 1900. And for a number of reasons, the turn of a century, as far back as we can trace, which is really 1700, is a very stressful time for people. Church attendance goes up, religious conversions go up. There's a lot of stress in the literature and the art and cultural stuff, because it just seems like it's like this psychological thing, like I don't know what's on the other side. And so the world was already a very, very rapidly changing place as we get towards 1900. We have the Industrial Revolution, we have all those political changes and stuff that we talked about, we have women starting to agitate, and then all of a sudden we have the turn of a century. Plus, we now have a unified Germany and a unified Italy, which kind of disrupt the balance of power. So getting into the first part of the 20th century, this is a very, very stressful time. And so it's not going to be a surprise that we're going to start laying the groundwork for a war that will be the Great War, what we call now World War I. So that's the end of this particular audio video thing, really. So, so hopefully, again, everyone's doing okay. And I will talk to you soon, one way or the other.